What is the state of the global economy? We'll examine the latest findings. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. On Thursday, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development gave its updated forecast on global economic growth, which it expects to hit 3.1% this year. The organization's Secretary-General Mathias Cormann said the outlook is positive.
There are now several reasons for some continued optimism for the months and quarters ahead. Global activity is proving relatively resilient. Private sector confidence is improving, inflation has declined.
Cormann also spoke about robust growth in Asia.
Emerging Asia, that is China, India, Indonesia, and dynamic Asian economies, continues to account for more than half of all global growth.
While the global economy has been resilient, as we just heard, in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, there are still concerns about the impact of ongoing regional conflicts and looming international debt. To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from New York, Anthony Chan is a former chief economist at JPMorgan Chase & Company. From Kunshan, China, John Quelch is the executive vice chancellor at Duke Kunshan University. From Oregon, we're joined by Liang. She is chair professor of economics at Willamette University. And from Beijing, we're joined by John Gong. He is a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. John Gong, the OECD, putting a very positive spin on the outlook for the global economy there, as I've just said. It forecasts that China's GDP growth will be 4.7%. That's a revision upwards from will be 4.7%. Will be 4.9% up from 4.7%. The Chinese government, of course, has set a target of 5%. What do you make of that?
Well, that's a very optimistic forecast. I think we may have a slight chance of achieving this. Well, I mean, the government has set a 5% goal, around a 5% goal, as you have known. And the first quarter number, at least I think is better than this average goal, which comes in at 5.3%. And moving forward, I think I have reason to believe that the second quarter is going to continue this trend. So I might not be that optimistic of saying that it's going to be close to 6%, but I think I'm more inclined to say that we're probably going to see around a 5.5% GDP overall growth for 2024. I want to point out that China's economy is right on a track of a resilient recovery, I would call it. And I think from a global perspective, the two conflicts you mentioned, I tend to believe that the world is probably getting into a new equilibrium where most countries are starting to be stabilized or accustomed to the ongoing conflicts. It doesn't seem that they're going to end anytime soon, but nevertheless, the world is getting used to that. If you look at the commodity prices, they're getting stabilized. Look at the inflation number, they're getting down to very low inflation, at least in many countries, at least here in China. I think economic life and corporate activities are also getting used to that, I think. So we're getting to a new equilibrium where the conflicts are ongoing, whereas the rest of the world economy is going on with its own business as usual.
Anthony, let's look at the situation in the United States. Now, these OECD figures tell us that the U.S. economy has been particularly resilient. They're expecting growth of 2.6%. What is your response to that number, given that inflation continues to be a problem in the United States? In fact, we just heard from the Federal Reserve that interest rates will not be changing anytime soon.
I think that's right, Anand. Inflation is turning out to be a bit stickier than the Federal Reserve would like it to be. But when you look at the consumer price index peak at 9.1%, or even if you look at the inflation metrics that the Federal Reserve likes to look at, namely personal consumption deflator, if you look at the headline number, that's 2.5%. And if you look at that number excluding food and energy, it's 2.7%. So we can quibble about the fact that it's not at 2%, but it's getting awfully close. It's just that it's not going down as quickly as the Federal Reserve would like it to go. With regard to economic growth, it's been pretty resilient. Yes, the first quarter kind of stumbled a little bit with a 1.6% growth in the first quarter. But if you look and you go underneath the hood, you'll realize that much of that weakness was in fact due to inventory changes. And of course, the government and things like that. If you take out inventories, government expenditures, and you certainly take out the exports, what you'll find is that the growth rate was closer to 3.1%. So that's really measuring what consumers are doing in the United States, and it's fairly robust. And in fact, in the second quarter, the Atlanta Federal Reserve, which is a very reliable metric of what's likely to happen, is already forecasting 3.3% economic growth in the second quarter. So I would agree with you, Anand. It sounds resilient to me.
Yep. John Quelch, the OECD report says the EU and Britain are significantly lagging behind China and the United States. In fact, it expects the Eurozone economy to expand 1.5% in 2025, with Britain at 0.4%. Why these relatively low numbers for the Eurozone?
Thank you, Anand. Well, first of all, there's wide variance within the Eurozone. And if you just take the unemployment figures for a moment as an indicator, Spain is at around about 12%, Italy and France around 7%, Germany 3%, the UK 4%. So there's wide variance. But all of these economies face significant demographic overhang. There is a weakness in terms of population and therefore demand growth, except in those economies which are significantly dependent on export earnings. And as world trade has picked up post-COVID, those economies, especially the German economy, have benefited. Structurally, the Eurozone is in weaker shape than China and the US. And of course, the level of entrepreneurship in those countries in the EU is always lagging that level of entrepreneurship in the US and China. So this is a problem, I think, for the Eurozone, not just now, but in the longer term as well.
Young Liang, the OECD says that there are signs right now that global inflation is easing. It expects the global output of goods and services to increase by 3.1% and global economic growth to reach 3.2% in 2025. So everything would appear to be trending in the right direction. What are your thoughts on that?
Right, good to talk to you, Anand. So I would say, yes, I think resilience has been really the buzzword from both the IMF and, from this OECD report. However, I think it's also important to note that the global growth rate has been really projected to be low compared to the decades before, the pandemic. So in a way, 3.1% growth rate is positive, but it's really below the sort of potential. We're not yet revert back, to the pre-pandemic kind of level. And second, I think is really that what John Quelch was talking about, this kind of great variation between countries. China, India, some of the Asian economies, and as well as some of the other emerging markets as well as the United States have been showing, robust growth. But I think we're also leaving out many countries that are struggling, especially we're talking about, some of the low-income countries. 60% of the low-income countries are either at debt distress or on the brink of debt distress. So I think we're not yet sort of out of the woods. And in terms of food and energy prices, yes, there are signs that, they've been trending down. But then also, for example, when you look at the United States, the inflation has been sticky. The energy price has gone down, but not as much as back in March. food price also has risen. So I think, we're still not sort of completely sort of out of that inflation, and also, the slow growth in many areas of the world. I think the United States is aided by this very large fiscal stimulus, but European countries have still struggled because of the ECB's rate is still, continue to be high, and also their fiscal budget has been tight. So I think it really depends, going forward, the second and the rest of the year depends on policies, and also depends on some of these regional conflicts, whether they will be contained or there's any risk of spreading.
John Gong, China will be the main driver of global growth, accounting for something like 21% of global growth, and that's through 2029. That's according to a report in Bloomberg. Its share will be bigger than all the G7 economies combined. And if we look at Asia, for instance, some of the biggest economies are in Asia. We talked about China, we talked about India, there's Japan, Indonesia is in that mix as well. What is driving growth in Asia?
Well, first of all, most of the countries in Asia are in the developing country camp, and naturally, these countries' GDP growth usually is much higher than the growth rates prevalent in the developed world, and that's a common empirical phenomenon. I think this has a lot to do with the potential of growth, because usually not so much developed countries, they have a much potential to grow in many areas, not as mature as in the developed world. I mean, that's a given. I think if you ask the question where the next growth are coming from, well, I think there are a lot of opportunities in the emerging market economies, especially I think in Southeast Asia countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia. In these countries, this is a very vibrant area in my view. It's the new epicenter of the world, of the global economy, and with the investment, intra-Asia investment, especially I think coming from countries like Japan, South Korea, and China in this region, and you would expect to see a lot of investment activities. And I think it's also very much driven by the opportunities here in China as well, especially I think related to the climate agenda. You have to keep in mind that China is rapidly developing, moving in that direction to address the climate problems. Look at the automobile industry that's been often talked about. There's an entire electrification movement across the automobile industry here in China. It's going to spillover effect in the rest of the world. Chinese automobile companies are setting up factories in countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and they're selling electric cars over there. So, the automobile industry in itself creates a lot of jobs, a lot of opportunities for companies. It's a very deep value chain. So, it's things like that are really driving the growth in my view. With a peaceful environment in the region, hopefully we're going to continue to have a peaceful environment in this region. I would expect that this entire region, Southeast Asia, East Asia region, and Southern Asia, would represent the best investment opportunities for many multinational companies. And certainly from an economic growth perspective, this is the most vibrant area in the world right now.
Anthony, the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, she talked with CNN about the labor market in the United States. Let's listen to some of what she had to say.
The good news is that the U.S. has very strong labor market, demand remains strong, and growth in the United States surprised us in the beginning of the year on the upside. That translates into bad news, because when the economy is so strong, then the Fed has no reason to look at rate cuts, and that translates into bad news for the rest of the world.
So, Anthony, there she said it there. The Fed has no real incentive to lower interest rates when things are looking so good. But there are concerns over stagflation and over the debt getting to, what, $34 trillion. I mean, what are your thoughts on Washington's policies and the concern that she pointed out there and how the rest of the world would be impacted?
Well, Anand, you've been hearing a lot of chatter about stagflation. I recently wrote a piece on Substack.com under the People's Economist that compared the periods in the 1970s and 80s when you had issues of stagflation. And it's almost ludicrous to think that when you look at what happened in the 70s, when you had super high unemployment and you had super high inflation, that somehow today, when you have inflation rates that are below 3% and you have unemployment rates that have been below 4% for over 2 years, that people would be characterizing the current period as stagflation. I think the Fed chairman also said it best by saying that there's very little stag because the economy is growing, not contracting, and there's little inflation because the inflation rate has come down from 9% at a peak to below 3%. So very little stagflation. And with regard to the labor market, yes, the labor market has been very strong. Also did some research on another Substack article that actually finds that one of the reasons why the labor market is so strong, because we've had more immigration and therefore we've allowed the labor force to grow faster than many had predicted as an influx of immigration has occurred. And many of the state and local governments have issued work permits to these immigrants a lot faster than they used to. All that is helping the labor market. And that's why, yes, we are seeing labor costs going up, but they could have gone up even faster if we would not have seen as many immigrants actually working.
Okay, we are going to take a break right now. More of our conversation on the global economy, that's coming up. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the latest on the global economy. John Quelch, there's at least one analyst in Europe who believes that the Eurozone lag that we were talking about a few minutes ago is because of a lack of competitiveness. And that analyst, he is Zach Myers, who is the Assistant Director of the Center for European Reform. Let's listen to some of what he had to say, John.
When we think about the competitiveness problem, there's several elements to it in reality. The first is that the EU has had much slower economic growth than the US or China for decades now. The second is that traditional EU industries like car manufacturing are facing technological and commercial challenges, including from the US and China, which are pumping a lot of public subsidies into their industries.
So, John Quelch, what do you make of that assessment?
Well, as he says, Anand, it's been for decades that Europe competitiveness has been soft compared to that of the United States. And of course, the emergence of China over the last 40 years has further eroded the comparative strength and influence of the EU zone in the world economy. There are certain bright spots. Of course, there are excellent companies in each European country, and especially in Germany, we have a very strong, still a very strong, robust Mittelstand of middle-range companies that do an excellent job of serving world markets with primarily engineering-based technology. But as the world pivots so quickly to AI, it's a matter of record that the level of investment of EU universities, EU universities and R&D combined relative to the investment that is being put in China and in the United States, it's just not enough to keep up with this pivot. And so I'm afraid that the Eurozone is in definite difficulty regarding restoring its competitive edge, indeed, if it had one.
Right, Liang, you know, we've been talking about that OECD report, and as I said, they put a very positive spin on it. But we've been hearing about concerns for some time now about the impact that the two big conflicts in the world right now, the one in Ukraine as well as the one in Gaza, the impact that those conflicts could have on the global economy, especially when we talk about things like energy in the Middle East. In fact, the Saudi defense minister told a World Economic Forum meeting in Riyadh this week that geopolitical threats are increasing, not decreasing.
Right. I think this assessment is fair. I think we're now in a place or in the time where we're transitioning from the unipolar world to the more multipolar world. And there's been, conflicts, you mentioned just two hot regional wars. They're definitely destabilizing the global economic and social order, not to mention all the humanitarian crises and the lives that are being claimed by these crises and these wars. Mm-hmm. But I think also, the U.S.-China relationship, even though it has been stabilized, but we also know that there are a lot of headwinds. And also in terms of the economic competition and also all these protectionism policies, I think all this would in some ways hamper the growth of the global economy and also the stability, as well as, I think very importantly, the fight against the climate change. So I think all of these are really important challenges facing the world. And so I think, for example, China's growth now is robust, partly because there's very strong external demand. But, with these contentions about EVs and all these other, trade policies, I think, we could see more headwinds down the road. And for the United States, even though its economy is growing strong, but we also know with these higher for longer rate hikes, there could see some long-term negative impacts when it comes to financial instabilities. We just had one regional bank that just failed, and that, I think coincidentally, this is when the Fed's, BTFP policy has expired last March, which provides the liquidity for some of these banks. So again, I think with the high rates, it also in some ways depressed the investments in the green energies, and there's reliable research that has shown, the high interest rate typically affect the renewable energy sector than the traditional fossil fuel industries. So like I said, we're also seeing all these other ramifications with high rates with regard to developing countries, debt, and with the energy and price instability. So I think, again, there's a lot of common challenges facing the world. So I think, as John mentioned earlier, the peaceful development is really important going forward, and whether countries are able to really, restrain themselves and trying to move towards a more sort of peaceful and more developmental-oriented path.
John Gong, there is one other development which is causing some worries, and that is some countries are seeing their currencies depreciating, and that's because of what's been termed the U.S. strong dollar policy. What is the consequence of that? I mean, what kind of impact can we see?
Well, we have had this phenomenon for quite some time by now, and my guess is that we're actually getting fairly close to the end of that cycle. I don't see the Fed raising rates anymore. I think it's a matter of time that it will start to drop rates. There's been, fairly optimistic view about the Fed dropping rates, how many times it's going to drop this year. But given the inflation statistics a little bit spiking up a little bit, probably, that optimism has been mitigated a little bit. But nevertheless, I would still argue that we're towards the end of the rate increase cycle. Moving forward, it's only going to be going down. So this is actually pretty good news for many countries that are burdened with a lot of external debt and currency depreciation. I think the direction of the dollar's movement is probably going to be, towards depreciation. It has been it's been strong for so much time now. It's actually hurting the export sector.
Right.
And I think it's, from American government's perspective, a little bit weaker dollar is actually in its own national interest. It helps exporting. It helps easing the monetary pressure in the United States. So I think this is actually I would expect the Fed to decrease its interest rate at least maybe once, maybe probably twice for the rest of the year. So I think this is actually very good news for many countries that are in that situation. And from China's perspective, I would expect, given the strong performance in the trade sector, the export sector, I would expect RMB to be getting a little bit stronger this year.
Anthony, I've just got about a minute left, but I want to talk about this meeting that the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen held with the House Committee on Tuesday to talk about R&D tax credit. This was part of an effort on global minimum tax. It's part of the actually it's part of the 15% global minimum tax created by the OECD. I mean, how will that work?
Well, I think the goal is certainly to stimulate investment, and but at the same time, what you've seen that whenever they try to coordinate any of these things globally, it takes a long time. The 15% minimum tax that Janet Yellen was a big proponent is not really going anywhere. My hope and expectation is that at some point, countries around the world will start cooperating rather than fighting each other with regard to these policies. But right now, the goal is to promote more investment, and hopefully that will occur.
Right. John Quelch, we've got about 30 seconds left. There is also the issue of global debt. In fact, Borge Brende, the president of the World Economic Forum, said we haven't seen this kind of debt since the Napoleonic Wars. We're getting close to 100% of GDP.
It's very concerning, and I think even though world asset prices may have risen so that the debt as a percentage of world assets is relatively modest, it's still ticking up every year. And in most democracies, it's not on the political discourse agenda anymore, because both parties in most democracies have contributed to the problem.
Right. That is where we have to leave it. We have run out of time. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.